afternoon and welcome to Enpsychedelia on this Sunday afternoon, or if you're listening via podcast or watching the video at whatever time it happens to be. My name is Nick, and thank you very much to Freedom of Species on every Sunday right before us, 1pm till 2pm on 3CR. If you want to find out anything more about Freedom of Species, 3cr.org.au is the place to go. You can find their podcast, you can find their social media, you can find their website, and lots more information about them. Oh my gosh, COVID round two, hooray! Feel like it's a bit, slightly nuttier this time around. Joining me across from the Zoom panel as we record our show in isolation, Ash, how you going?
Yeah, okay. Yep, COVID round two.
So we will and have been producing more content that you can find on YouTube. Also been working with organisations like the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, AOD Media Watch, which is at aodmediawatch.com.au, and Yarra Drug Health Forum is ydhf.org.au to help produce some of their video content for, keeping that local discussion on drugs and drug policy going, especially when we are in such interesting times, and one of the difficulties is getting good information at the moment, which is why, over the past few months we've been catching up with people like Dr. Monica Barrett, Dr. Stephen Bright, about things like the 2019 National Drug Strategy Household Survey, which the results for that just came out a couple of weeks ago, and we caught up with Dr. Stephen Bright to talk briefly about that. We've started to see that some of the festivals that would be on over summer have started to pull the plug because they're concerned the risk is too high that they might not be able to run the festival. So several festivals have already postponed. They don't want to put their resources into something that just might not happen. So we might not even have a real festival season this year.
Yeah, I didn't really expect that we would have a festival season this summer. Just knowing how these things are organised, like the work usually starts months out from the event. You've got promotional teams, starting the work, booking DJs, booking performers. There's a lot of work that happens year round to put a festival on. And there's always, there's a fair bit of risk in putting them on as well. It costs a lot of money to do all of that work before the event. And, even if you've got insurance, you're unlikely to see all of that back. So I fully expected that we wouldn't really have a festival season this year.
We want to jump into hearing a couple of voices from a recent Students for Sensible Drug Policy webinar that was held for Support Don't Punish Day, which was the 26th of June. There were 3 speakers at this event. There was Mary Harrod from NUA, New South Wales Users and AIDS Association. There's Tara Schultz, who's a commentator and a person with lived experience, and also Dr. Peta Malins from RMIT, talking with the SSDP webinar audience. This is only a small snippet of it. If you want to find the rest, SSDP Australia will be uploading it to their YouTube soon, and we'll share a link there. Here it is. This is Enpsychedelia.
Today is International Support Don't Punish Day, which is an international day of protest to counter the United Nations Office of Drug and Crimes International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. It's organised by the International Drug Policy Consortium, and tonight we're also partnering with Paradigma, which is broadly an international coalition of various harm reduction youth policy orgs around the world. Today widely calls for an approach to substance use, which isn't punitive or one that causes more harm, and instead supports people regardless of their decision to use or cease use of drugs. Together tonight, we've brought 3 speakers who will speak to the intersections of all of these things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Just as background about NUA, to start with, because it's really relevant in this context. We're a drug user organisation in New South Wales, and we were founded in 1989 during the HIV pandemic. Harm minimization is demand reduction, so that's delaying the onset of drug use, treatment, and supply reduction. And I'm going to read this one. Preventing, stopping, disrupting, or otherwise reducing the production and supply of illegal drugs, and controlling, managing, or regulating the availability of legal drugs. Harm reduction is the third pillar of the National Drug Strategy, which is reducing the adverse social and economic consequences of the use of drugs for the user, their families, and the wider community. And it's not a bad, the three pillars of harm minimization are conceptually pretty sound. And I think that the thing that is missing from the three pillars of harm minimization is targeting individual drug users and penalizing and criminalizing individual drug users. And that's the way our policy is carried out in Australia. And it's just very interesting for me to reflect that it's not actually part of our national drug strategy. There's human rights violations, are quite frequent. And these are two examples in New South Wales: strip searches. So over 5,000 people were strip searched in 2018. 91% of these strip searches were done for drug possession. As many people would know, they're being done illegally. They're targeting young people aged 25 and younger. Some people under the age of 18 are being searched, and there is a higher proportion of Aboriginal people that are being searched.
We need to shift away from that focus, as Mary was saying, on using police and prisons to regulate drugs, because largely because drug criminalisation is a key mechanism of racial oppression and oppression of other marginalised groups. And then the second part of my talk, I'll be looking more specifically about how policing also operates to increase drug-related health harms, and that's where I'll be looking more specifically at my drug detection dog work. So I want to just say that first and foremost, the reason we need urgent drug policy and drug law reform is for reasons of racial and social justice. So understanding that big picture context is really important. And that importance of really shifting away from policing, a reliance on policing and prisons, towards community welfare, community wellbeing, and health types of responses. But secondly, and this is what I'm going to turn to now, there's also, of course, and this is not unrelated to that first point, we need to shift away from policing of drugs because it also causes on the ground a range of completely unnecessary health harms and health risks for people who are using drugs. And research has really been showing for decades that policing of drugs interferes with harm reduction practices and results in increased risk of infection, violence and overdose. And my research, which I'll talk about now, looking at police use of drug detection dogs or sniffer dogs, really provides an example of how some of those harms are being produced on the ground. Yeah, my research has really been looking at the impacts of police use of drug detection dogs around Australia, and I've interviewed a bunch of people about their experiences. The first concerning thing is to note that police around Australia have been increasingly using sniffer dogs to search for illicit drugs on people in public places such as music festivals, events, bars and clubs and pubs, on train stations, particularly in Sydney, but also in Melbourne and other places, and even in and around and on city streets. They've been increasing and expanding the use of drug dogs, despite evidence for a long time showing some of the harms and problems and inefficiencies of this technology. The first thing perhaps to note is that research has shown that the dogs are not very effective at leading police to drugs. So positive dog identifications, where the dog, sits down because it identifies that somebody is carrying drugs, actually only result in police locating drugs about a quarter of the time. So between 70 and 80% of the time, the person is not found to be carrying drugs. And even when police do find drugs on the person, it's nearly always only small personal use amounts that are being found. So the police drug detection dog programs are not at all searching for or finding high-level dealers. It's not an effective way to do that. The second thing to note is that the drug detection dogs, and my research backs up early research showing this, they're having little to no deterrent effect on levels of drug use, but are instead resulting in a range of really dangerous changes to the way that people use and carry their drugs. So, for example, and this came out in my interview research as well, in response to the presence of drug detection dogs, people are instead choosing to stash drugs internally, so in vaginal or anal cavities, which can increase health risks. They're choosing to wait and buy drugs inside events and festivals, which is generally more dangerous than buying from a known supplier. They're choosing to shift sometimes to less detectable but sometimes more dangerous drugs, or ones that they have less experience with. And perhaps most concerningly, people are talking about preloading their drugs, taking all of or more of their drugs before arriving, so they don't have to carry them through past the dogs, or, and this is the most dangerous of all, panicking when they see the dogs and taking all or a lot more than they would usually take of their drugs at once. And in Australia, at least 3 overdose fatalities have already been linked by coroners to this kind of panicked ingestion. So we can see the ways in which a policing strategy, which to many people would seem like a very self-evident or common sense kind of way to try to reduce drug problems, and especially around recreational drug use, is actually not serving any sort of good purpose, but in fact is causing a whole range of harms. The other thing to note, and this came out in my research, which was actually really trying to look beyond just those harms to other kinds of harms as well, found that, of course, the use of drug detection dogs results in a lot of trauma for people. So, of course, fear and anxiety and stress at the time, but also lasting trauma. And it's really well documented that searches, and particularly strip searches that go along with drug detection dog use, are inherently degrading, humiliating, violent, and dehumanising. And the use of these kinds of searches can cause deep and lasting trauma. And this is particularly so for survivors of past violence and abuse, who can experience those strip searches as a form of sexual abuse in many cases. And one of my interview participants talked at length about the impact that had on her, and the triggering and re-traumatising impacts. When police do find drugs, they're much, much more likely to make Indigenous people go through the courts. And I think that the article talked about the police were 4 times more likely to give a caution, so to not involve criminal charges and going through the court, 4 times more likely to give a caution to a non-Indigenous person than an Indigenous person. So we need to urgently invest instead in community care and transformative justice type practices around primary prevention, health, education, and finding other ways to address drug issues in Australia that don't involve prisons and policing.
So I'm coming in from a lived experience perspective, having grown up as one of the many victims of the war on drugs. It really starts with my father, he was the sole carer of me and my brother. And from the age of 3 or 4 years old, police raids were a part of our life. Waking up in the middle of the night to flashing lights, our door being beaten down or broken down, hearing my father being beaten up in the next room. These were common facets of our lives. They were normal for us. And Dad was put in jail a few times, which meant that depending on where we lived, in the beginning we lived in our hometown and our grandparents would take us. But our dad became estranged from his family, and the constant police raids meant that we had to move. Now, we were on the run all over Australia from the police who targeted my father constantly. And you may be wondering what exactly my father did to warrant such heinous abuse. I mean, I recall one time, I've just got a photo here just to give you a little bit of a conception. I should put it in a slide. That's me and my dad. You know, he's a small kind of hippie, long-haired anarchist kind of dude, a very kind-natured, very timid, you know, pacifist kind of guy, very political. But one time I was on his shoulders and we were walking to kindergarten, and the police started driving up slowly behind us, lurking, you know, as though they were some kind of predator. And my dad would say to me, like, "Don't look, Tara, just don't look at them, you know, don't look." And I was 4, so I was growing up to learn that the police, who are representatives of the state, were evil, monstrous people who I needed to be fearful of. And on that particular day, they did grab my dad. They didn't have a warrant. They just tried to force him in the divvy van with me clutching his leg, crying and screaming. And it was all because they wanted to charge him with trafficking cannabis. And I'm not sure exactly how grabbing him off the street when he was walking his little kid to kindergarten would do that. He was only ever charged throughout his lifetime of possessing cannabis. When I was little, I learned that we were not a part of the same society that everyone else is a part of. I learned that we didn't exist in the same world that everyone else existed in. We were not allowed to call the police. We did not have access to the same institutions that everyone else is able to access normally. Even at school, one night after a police raid, me and my brother were in our room. We could hear our dad being beaten up in the next room. And we looked out the window and there was police standing kind of guard outside, and we devised a plan to grab the police's gun, grab a car, you know, rescue dad. And I was 4 and my brother was 6. I mean, this is a weird childhood to have, to figure out how – we were trying to figure out how to fight the state. By the time before we were even out of kindergarten or primary school, we were figuring out how to fight the state to rescue our father from violence. So the war on drugs, it may seem, you know, there are so many layers to it. It may seem on the surface there's this persecution and this criminalisation, but the impact it has on the kids of the families that are constantly harassed, when their parents are constantly being taken away and they're not able to form any kind of relationships with the community around them. When you're isolated, it can have dramatic effects on that person's sense of self. Even the concept of identity is asking, who am I in relation to you? You know, what is my worth? How am I different to you, or how am I the same as you? And I couldn't really develop that sense of identity except for as an outsider or as an other. So I just want to point out that when it comes to class and the war on drugs, the lower classes and the marginalised classes are the people who rely most on social support for mobility. So that means in order to get ahead in life, in order to gain status or to gain higher income, you have to be able to, I guess, recover from a variety of different things. My mother had severe schizophrenia. As I said, my dad was struggling. You know, you need all these different social supports, and these are all kind of left-wing ideals of community. They're ways in which the state would redirect funding, and they're not doing that. They're just tearing communities apart. So those that are born into poverty have very little help. So we did not belong, my family and I. We were the druggos and the deros. We were the bludgers, the junkies and the ferals. This language pervades our society today. This language is used constantly. You know, we are a drug addict and junkie. It's a way to label somebody as at fault for their own circumstances and their own adversity. It's a way to take the focus off shared social responsibility and place it at this stigmatized feet of those who choose to be deviant. And of course, then all of their problems are their own. So all of the lower class, all of the Indigenous communities, they're all at fault for being these druggos and these dole bludgers. And it's interesting, and this is a part of what I want to do my research on. I'm doing my honours year at RMIT. I want to know what it would mean for me to recover, or what it means for me to be in recovery, because I still haven't quite figured that out. As I said to you, I quit drugs when I was with that man, Peter, when he was abusing me. I abstained from drug use, and it didn't solve my life. Abstinence hasn't solved the myriad of problems in my life. So I want to know what does it mean to be in recovery? And so a lot of the research coming out now is talking about recovery capital or social capital. And that refers to, the opportunities and the benefits that are afforded through associated with social group memberships, family relationships, supportive of recovery, and includes, and it's important, access to material, informational and emotional social supports, material resources, education, physical and psychological health, coping and problem-solving skills, sense of meaning and purpose, and self-efficacy. None of that talks about police use. What I want to know is what does recovery mean within the war on drugs? So what does it mean to be a healthy, valid, productive member of society? And there's a focus on abstinence, which, as I addressed, wasn't really going to help me in any way. It doesn't, whether or not I am or I am not using drugs, it's not going to really address the myriad of problems that are essentially essentially a culture war. And how would treatment within these services address that history of poverty and address the intergenerational trauma, particularly for Indigenous people? And even in my family with my dad, he ended up passing away at 59. And my mother, she's hasn't reached 60, but, things aren't quite looking good for her. Not to mention the impacts of criminalisation and separation from community and society. So when I attended a detox, when I took that man to court, it was extremely hard on me. It brought up all of the trauma and all of the pain that I had suffered before. And I suffered from a chronic pain condition called fibromyalgia, which is closely linked to people who have experienced trauma. And it's very hard to get a diagnosis and it's extremely hard to get treatment. And what's more is that they'll prescribe you opioids. I think that recovery is political. This idea of recovery and the war on drugs and the intersection with drug treatment services is really important because a lot of the time there's a lot of I can never say the word infantilization within treatment services where you're treated like naughty kids and you're treated like you don't really know better and you're obviously making such bad decisions in your life that you need to be strip searched and you need to be told to go for a walk and what time you need to get up because you can't fend for yourself. So recovery is inherently political because you're reframing the context of who you are and your identity and how you fit into community.
I heard coke will help you if you have a blowout.
If I smoke DMT, will I lose control?
Cannabis is in the drug.
Eating LSD, magic mushroom, if you don't come back to
By
1980, illegal drugs were every bit as much a threat to the United States as enemy planes and missiles.
Did you know that most of the drug myths we grew up being told were based on fears and not facts?
I'm in the under 9s. And I'm
I hate this.
What's up?
It's that ad for drugs. It's horrible.
Well, drugs are a big problem. Worries the hell out of your father and I.
How come?
Do any kids at your school do drugs?
Yeah, I suppose.
Well, that's why. What would you say if someone offered you some?
That's a good point. What would you say if someone offered you some?
I'd tell them no. Never know what it could do to you.
Propaganda from the Just Say No era that fueled the war on drugs. Harm reduction has been part of Australia's drug strategy since 1985. Harm reduction is about promoting health and empowering our peers with credible, non-judgmental information so people can make informed choices. It's about changing the narrative to just say no. Because drug use is criminalised, governments, researchers, even people who use drugs don't know exactly how many people use drugs. Only a tiny percentage need treatment, and most people keep their use a secret. The best data we have shows about 9 million Australians have used an illegal drug. Since there's no commercial quality control of an illegal market though, you can't really be certain of what you're getting. You may as well be having a random floor score, which about 18% of people who've used an illegal drug have admitted to doing.
There are peer-based harm reduction organisations around the world, tailored to the nightlife and festival scene.
If you use drugs, it's important you know there are general harm reduction measures you can apply to reduce your risk. Consider set, setting, and drug, like you're doing a risk assessment. You, the human consumer, you're the set. Your overall health in the moment, your hunger, hydration, and genetic makeup influence the risk profile when taking a drug. The setting or environmental factors are an influence too. Set and setting are just as important to a drug-taking experience as the drug itself. So to practice harm reduction, you have to care about yourself, your environment, and about having reliable drug knowledge. One way to reduce the risks associated with drug use is to continue to ask the questions and remain curious. Some sources of information are more supportive than others. We must not underestimate the value of peer-based education, so we encourage you to discuss these topics with those around you who you trust. We don't agree with fear-mongering, judgment, or urban legends. We believe in evidence-based education. Don't be a victim of misinformation. You might want to consider doing a reagent test and try get an indication of what might actually be in a mystery baggie. But this is a very limited pill testing or drug checking option that does not eliminate the risk when you're using from an illegal market.
Dancewise have a large team of key peer educators. Check out dancewise.org.au. We are a health program of Harm Reduction Victoria and have a long history in drug and alcohol harm reduction education in the state.
If you still choose to use, you have the right to health. So make sure you're in the know. Have a quarter and some water. Learn before you gurn. Start low and take it slow. Be wise and dance more. Just say no.
Enpsychedelia on 3CR, and you have been hearing from a SSDP Students for Sensible Drug Policy Australia webinar that was recorded for Support Don't Punish Day on June 26th. Support Don't Punish calls for a rethinking of our drug policies away from measures that aim to punish and toward measures that aim to support those who are struggling with a addiction problem. The speakers there were Mary Harrod from NUA, New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, Dr. Peta Malins from RMIT University, and Tara Schultz, political commentator and person with lived experience to help tell that side of the story. This has been Enpsychedelia.